I'm sorry to say.
There are some extraordinary public moments in your journey away from the left. Tell us about the voice message left by the old communist diehard Dorothy Healey after you volunteered to testify against Bill Clinton and his aides, accusing them of lying when they said they were not slandering privately and defaming privately Monica Lewinsky.
Slandering and defaming publicly and privately Monica Lewinsky and several other truth-telling female witnesses, I might add. Well, I can't do Dorothy's wonderful, rasping old street fighter voice, but she was a veteran Stalinist who could claim credit, among other things, for recruiting Angela Davis to the Communist Party. And she and I had been friends of a kind. But she thought that to offer to tell my side of the story to a House hearing on the impeachment of the president was like my going to volunteer to testify to McCarthy hearings or something. I mean, there is somewhere on the left a deep belief that you're a stool pigeon if you're willing to give evidence.
Can you remember what she said? Because
well, yeah, I pretty much. I can't do her voice.
With you stinking little rat.
I can't do her rasping street fighting voice, but it was. So I won't even try. But it was, "Hey there, you scab and stoolie and rat fink. You know, I hope you die. There's no hell too hot for traitors like you." I mean, going on in this absolutely amazing way. I mean, she'd by then lost most of her communist convictions. I mean, as who had not by then. But something of the old sort of real party line spirit was still alive in her, and she thought she'd identified a rat fink, and it sort of made her feel all her brave days were back again.
On a serious note, the Clinton episode had a searing effect on your friendship with Sidney Blumenthal, and I'm wondering if now there could be any chance of a reconciliation.
I rather tend to think not. He considered himself to have been injured by me, and I can perfectly see his point of view. When he told me that Monica Lewinsky was stalking the president, and I remember thinking, even as he was telling me, how can a president be stalked in his own White House? If he doesn't want to see her, he sure doesn't have to. What nonsense. But when he told me this, it hadn't then become a public issue. It hadn't, as it did in the impeachment hearings. It then became a question, had the White House, in fact, used executive power to defame a potential witness? So I'd been told it before it was, so to speak, so toxic. But I thought, if I was asked, I wasn't going to say I hadn't been told it. That would have been suppressing evidence, among other things, which I'm not prepared to do. But it did put Sidney in a very bad position, and he's entitled to resent it. Though I think he should resent the president who put him in such a false position, and to having hired him for his brains, which are considerable, and his political insight, which is likewise not negligible, preferred to use him as a dirty trickster, as since has his wife. Most of the slanders against Obama that were circulated in the last election have Sidney Blumenthal's fingerprints on them. I'm sorry to say, we wouldn't have much to talk about if we were to meet again.
We were talking about the transformation that you underwent in Sarajevo.
Yes.
The sense that the use of military power against despots is necessary. The war in Iraq was probably the biggest experiment ever, maybe the biggest we'll ever see in regime change and nation building. But it does appear to have been a failure.
Well, it depends how you quantify it. I mean, it's a terrible disappointment, and of course disappointment's too neutral a word because that suggests no one's really responsible for it. I mean, there were some things that couldn't have been foreseen about Iraq, but there were some that could, for which no provision was made at all by the American planners. And that's, I describe it in my book as an impeachable culpability. There were also things that were not just not done, but that were done, such as the atrocities at Abu Ghraib, for example, which, again, one would qualify as impeachably culpable and damnable. But there's the unquantifiable which I think deserves a bit more attention than it gets. Our Iraqi friends have written a federal constitution inscribing rights for national and religious and ethnic minorities, where differences are to be settled by parliamentary election, which have been two, both of them in the teeth of appalling odds and intimidation, both of them so far with very disappointing outcomes. There's a Supreme Court, there's a free press, there's or the simulacrum of one, the idea of one, and quite a lot of the practice of it. Almost every Iraqi now has a cell phone. They were illegal till quite recently. But a huge number of Iraqis can connect to the internet. They have a convertible currency. They have diplomatic relations with other countries now, which are impossible under the UN rules of the old regime. Iraq was sanctioned almost out of its sovereignty because of the crimes it had committed and not uncommitted. It's still a maimed and traumatized country coming out of 3.5 decades of war and fascism, and the political class is made up of pygmies. Saddam Hussein made a clean sweep of the intellectuals and of any possible rival, but it has a pulse now. I can't say that I know that the Iraqis will take advantage of all the wonderful enactments that they've made, but I still think it's an inspiring thing to see, to have seen, and for the very small part I can claim to have played in advocating it, I would say I was proud.
But if you want a policy of US intervention to bring down despotic regimes, to move countries towards democracy, to build nations, you actually have to prove it'll work. And that seems to be the big problem here, because one cannot imagine anymore the United States committing itself to this kind of experiment in regime change. So it's over.
You're quite right. I mean, that's probably not the least of the casualties of the thing. Well, though when one says casualties, one mustn't forget the tens of thousands of Iraqis who've been murdered, most of them by people who we wrongly call insurgents. That's to say, the hired international psychopaths of al-Qaeda in an open, very cynical alliance with the riffraff of the previous Ba'athist regime, who know where the bodies are buried, who know where the weapons are, who know where everyone lives still, a lot of them, and we've been able to do, in proportion to their size, fantastic damage to Iraqi society, never giving it a minute to try and recover its breath. But yes, again, non-quantifiable casualty. Complete collapse, I think, of any will in the United States to have another such confrontation. Great skepticism in the international community about taking on any such undertaking, and as a result, I feel I can sense it. At the moment, there's a real sense of impunity and confidence and swagger among regimes like those in Burma and Zimbabwe and Sudan and Iran. They all act not just as if you can't touch us, we've got Chinese backing, which is, of course, part of the story, but you can't touch us, and we know you won't. And that's a terrible thing. I was fervently hoping that the removal of Saddam Hussein would be the beginning of an era of democratization and the realization that the age of dictatorship is dead. Dictatorships are redundant. They're historically condemned as well as morally. Not so.
You obviously watched the Tea Party phenomenon very closely, and
Yes.
I was intrigued to see you referring to it as, in a way, white America coming to terms with the fact that it may, or certainly will eventually be, a minority in this country.
Well, I think one of the great latent causes of anxiety in American society at the moment is the realization among white people that if they're not going to become a minority, I think that's the way they think about it. That's a long way off, but they will no longer be the majority. That's rather different. I mean, they'll be the largest population, but they won't be the preponderant one. And the various forms that this anxiety takes, the silliest of which is the Tea Party, and in some ways the nastiest. I mean, I think obviously it's a serious question, as is the decline of the United States and Americans having to get used to the idea of being one power among many. Something the Tea Party has nothing to say about, by the way. They don't have a foreign policy. They don't discuss defense or foreign affairs. They don't know much about it or seemingly care. They are another incarnation of the old know-nothing isolationist tradition. And that shows also in their domestic attitudes. I mean, whatever tone of voice we're going to have to come up with to discuss the ethnic balance of the future of America. And it'll have to be very careful and thoughtful, I think, and well-mannered. We know what tones of voice you can't discuss it in, and that's the tone of voice these people adopt. Calling the president a secret Muslim, or a closet Kenyan, or, believe me, this is said, and widely disseminated, the unacknowledged love child of Malcolm X. You know, try anything once. Any old smear will do. It makes me very angry. I've seldom seen in my longish life grown-ups behaving as stupidly, as immaturely in an election as in the last cycle in this country.
Can I bring you to where we started with your illness and the effect on how you think? It's clear from the way you were talking that you're still engaged with the ongoing conflicts in the world around you. I mean, is that necessarily part of your condition, that you remain engaged with what's happening in contemporary politics in the United States, that you don't sort of drift away from that and start thinking only about the bigger issues?
Well, I think...
By which I mean life and death.
Yes. Well, all the time I've been doing this, and I've always spent a good bit of my life on the political questions and trying to keep up with them and trying to influence the outcome as best I can. I've always known I was going to die. And I've always known that, in theory, it could be any day. So all I know is that squared now. It doesn't remove my interest, no. Because if one wanted to become, or had a tendency to become cynical and burned out, I think you're just as likely to do it when you've got a comfy middle age to look forward to, as not. Hope that's a fair answer.
Christopher, we're really very happy that you're able to keep your side of the bargain with us.
Well, very nice of you to offer.
All I can say is thank you.
Well,
and until next time.
Yes, absolutely. Many more times.